The 20 warmest years on record have been in the past 22 years. More than 1 million species are at risk of extinction by climate change. Humans, just 0.01% of all life, have destroyed 83% of all wild mammals. With statistics like that, it's easy to feel hopeless about the future we as humans have created for ourselves. We often get flooded with imagery of polar bears dying, icebergs shrinking, and the environment crumbling around us. And it can get especially overwhelming, since we personally have not been responsible for the emissions and environmental damage done over the last 200 years, but we carry the burden of fixing it. Personally, I have found the subject quite distressing, but our future does not have to be distressing. There are means to fix the future we have created for ourselves. In order to find out what our situation looks like and how we can address it, I met with sustainability investment expert and founder of Green Needham, Michael Graves, to discuss the current state we are in as not only a country, but as a planet.
Meeting the moment on climate change must begin with a recognition that every nation has a responsibility and every nation is at risk. Hurricanes and wildfires don't confine themselves to national borders. Instability and displacement in one country has ripple effects that are felt throughout the regions and across the world. Taking on climate change together is more than just the right thing to do. It's also in everyone's best interest to do it.
With President Biden's recent plan to reduce carbon emissions by 50% by, I think it's 2030, do you think that is enough? Like that objective, do you think that will be enough to push people towards?
Well, there's obviously a goal to really reduce carbon emissions almost completely in the 2050 target to get to the 1.5 degrees of warming and all that. But to get from here to there, you have to have intermediate targets. This was something important that was in the Massachusetts legislatures, the bill that got passed and signed this year. We already had a target in Massachusetts, a legally binding target to drop our emissions by 80%, by 2050. What we needed was the push to get there. So, President Biden's target is very similar in that sense, and to our new, more aggressive target, because you need to get started. You need to start moving now. You need to do the things that are easier to do, and that will kind of help prepare us. And frankly, that gives also technology a chance to come up with some new things. People who obsess and worry about we don't know how we're going to get all the way there. That's not the right question. The question is, how do you take advantage of all the things we have now to deploy to drop carbon emissions as much as possible and keep those targets moving so that you can get there by 2050? There have been a couple of terrific reports. There's one by a researcher who's now at Princeton looking at the different ways that the United States can get to the 2050 targets, to basically that net zero economy. And what he finds is there's a lot of pathways to do it. There's a very low cost pathway. There's slightly more expensive pathways. And by expensive, I just mean that it doesn't mean that the overall benefit isn't going to be positive financially. It just means there's different ways to do it. And there are multiple ways to do it that depend on policy choices that we want to make. And the interesting thing about this is all done with this is done with modeling, computer modeling, is that none of the targets, none of the paths that he shows are requiring significant changes to consumers. They don't have to all stop eating meat, all have to have EVs, all have to have new homes by that time. Now, some of the things that we can do may make significant dents in it, but what he's showing is that there are ways that we can get using technology, policy, and money, levers we have today, capital, to get to where we need to get to. And that's a very positive message. But to your point previously, it's important that people, we get going, set targets so that we know where we want it. What can we accomplish in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, and then out to 2050?
Great. And I think that kind of going along with that, do you think we as a country are putting enough pressure on our foreign adversaries to be more carbon friendly, I guess?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, first of all, we have to get our own horse house in order, and for the last 4 years, we were not in a position to point to anybody.
Hmm.
But let's assume that we have leadership now, and hopefully into the future, that's going to do the same thing. The Europeans are, quite frankly, ahead of us in some ways because they're setting some pretty aggressive targets. And then the challenges are in really in China and in India, countries like that, and they need to step up their game too, but they're also pointing and essentially saying, well, we're still developing. We're still giving our people all the things your people already have, right? And so it's a bit of a two-headed monster because in a sense, we still produce a lot of carbon emissions per person. So we have a lot of work to do, right? China doesn't produce as many carbon emissions per person as we do, but they produce way more because they're 5 times as big as we are. So, they have serious work to do because getting rid of the coal plants is really important to them. We've gotten rid of a lot of our coal plants a lot faster, by the way, than people thought. If you went back 10 years ago, 12 years ago, where over 50, 60% of the electricity in this country was generated by coal, it's come down since then, much faster than people thought. Now it's moved to gas. Now, gas is not a carbon-free source, but it's still the net benefit to the environment in reducing carbon is pretty significant. Um, the other interesting thing that a report that just came out, a couple of just came out recently, focusing on the importance of methane and reducing methane in the atmosphere. And the reason for that is methane is way more. It's got a way more of a carbon warming than carbon dioxide, but it also disappears much faster. So it has a huge hit, and if you can reduce methane quickly, the impact on the carbon in the atmosphere is going to be much faster. So it's an interesting report that really points to something that Biden is working on and should never have happened to the previous administration, in which they said, "Well, we don't really care how much oil and gas how much methane they blow off." That made absolutely no sense. Frankly, it didn't make sense for the industry because when you flare methane from a gas or you leak it from oil, you leak it from pipelines, you're wasting it. I mean, even if you didn't care about the environment, if you were the business delivering that gas, when I let it go into the air, that's it's like throwing money away. So it never made sense. But anyway, so that's something that I think, and that doesn't consumers don't have as much of a role in that, but certainly from policy perspective, it's supporting that would be very important. The consumer's role is going to be much more important in the carbon dioxide emissions, right? Transportation, buildings, right? The three sectors that when you think of 4 sectors, let's kind of divide the whole economy into 4 big sectors. Electricity. So everything that uses electricity, transportation, cars, trucks, planes, buildings, heating and cooling. And then what I would lump into from a consumer perspective, agriculture and industry. Now they are different, right? But when you make steel, you make concrete, or you grow crops, or you grow cattle, right? You have emissions. Right? So from the consumer's point of view, what we're trying to do is to get as much moved into electricity as possible. So we're not using fossil fuels to drive cars and trucks. We're not using fossil fuels to heat homes and buildings. We're doing it with electricity. And at the same time, the first thing we're doing and we have to do is get the grid clean, right? So that basically, if the grid is running on solar and wind and mostly renewables and some nuclear plants that still run and other things, then basically everything else that you do, if you do it with electricity, you're getting rid of the carbon in the atmosphere. So that's when you think about what can we as consumers do, that's where we all want to go. So the electricity sector, we can certainly support policies. You see the grid here is getting much cleaner. We as consumers can install solar. We can support our communities and the state installing solar and wind and offshore wind. All of that is going to help green the grid. So that's what we can do. Transportation, we can move to hybrids and electric vehicles wherever possible, as soon as possible. Certainly the businesses are starting to move in that direction. You've seen automobile companies, GM and others, Volvo, many are saying by 2030, 2035, we're not going to make ICE, internal combustion engines anymore. So, again, as we do that, we make it cleaner as consumers. Buildings is so homes, right? So what do homes do? Well, certainly in our homes, we can have energy efficiency, take home energy efficiency audits, which are free. We can add insulation, air sealing. We can make our homes as efficient as possible. In this part of the country, there's a lot of oil still and gas heat. Eventually, you'd like to see them all move to electric heat pumps, and that's not going to happen very quickly because if you already have a home, it could be an expensive transition. But the hope is to encourage builders to build new homes with heat pumps. And for those who aren't familiar with them, a heat pump is basically, think of it as an air conditioner working in reverse. Right? You use an air conditioner to to reduce heat, take heat from the air and cool a room. A heat pump does both of those things. It can either make a room cooler by removing heat, or it can take heat from outside and bring it in and heat a home. So those are kind of the things. And then on the agriculture and industry side, there's a lot of conversation, obviously, about reducing your footprint because meat, certainly growing meat, has a lot of carbon impact. So to my mind, and the way I try to think about it, is there's many different things people can do, so that if you can't or don't want to, like if you're a young person coming out of college and you're moving in the city, even if you could buy an EV, which you might be able to, you can't necessarily charge it. Here in Needham, I have a charger, right? I can plug my EV right into my home, right? But if you're living, say, in an apartment, you may not be able to do that. But maybe you can eat differently, or maybe I can eat differently once a week. I like meat. Some people have said, I'm just not going to eat meat at all. That's great. That's a choice. So we can all do things. And my view has always been to try to show people things they can do in all aspects of their life and try to, push those as far as you can go. I've never believed, well, I don't certainly want to give up meat, but lots of people can say, well, you don't need to eat meat every day. It's probably better. It's certainly better for you. Right. So if you get everybody to do a little bit of that and some people to say, hey, I'm just going to go completely, vegetarian. I'm not going to eat, meat at all. That's good too. But that's always the way I've approached it. And I think we've approached it from a Green Eater perspective, try to give people different options and encourage them to think about different ways to contribute that make sense for them.
Mhm. So I guess one of my last questions is, do you think that corporations place too much blame on consumers about carbon emissions?
That's an interesting, sometimes it's thought of as a chicken and the chicken or the egg question, but they are intertwined. Certainly, I think the challenge is in some businesses, and this is where regulation or having industries work together, whether it's voluntary, whether it's stakeholder based, really helps, because it's sometimes hard. I mean, to be very fair to businesses, it's hard to be the first business to do something because you got to invest in it, right? So you're going to be potentially at a disadvantage for a while, and if the consumers aren't buying it yet, you're hurting yourself, right? So there is some advantage in some cases where it's hard to do that, to basically find ways either through regulation, well, it's voluntary or regulatory, or through getting stakeholders together to say, you know what, if you can get the whole industry to move, right, then basically it helps push the consumers to move. Right. At the same time, it's also fair to say businesses respond to consumers. So, there are plenty of businesses that have stepped up and have been willing to say, look, we're going to do it this way because we believe we can attract more customers and new clients. And people will either pay more or they'll prefer to buy from us. And that's certainly true, too. So I think there's blame, if you want to call it that, or responsibility on both sides of the equation. Consumers can demand more energy efficient products. They can say to companies, listen, if you're going to be a really bad actor, I don't want to do business with you. I don't want to invest in you, or I'm going to choose to invest in other people. Right? So consumers have that power, but businesses, can also take a leadership role. And you are seeing that. With all of the criticism justified as much of it is on a company like an Amazon or some of the tech companies, many of those companies like Google and Facebook, who have a lot of other issues with from an environmental or governance or social standpoint, have made significant commitments to buy solar and renewable energy. Okay. So in a sense, if they said, look, we have data centers, we use tons of electricity, right? So we're going to go out and not just buy offsets. We're going to go and say, we're going to invest in wind projects and solar projects. So people can build large solar projects, large wind projects, attach them to the grid. And the financing for that comes because Google says, I'm willing to buy your output for the next 20 years. Now, the electrons don't necessarily flow directly to Google, but the point is because Google is committed to do it, or Facebook or Amazon, those electric plants, those large wind farms or solar things get built. So they can do those things. Other businesses can make their products more environmentally friendly. Certainly, plastics is a big issue as well. I'm sure you've come across that one. So there's a lot of things that businesses can do, but they do need to be pushed. Sometimes by consumers, and sometimes by consumers and others getting together in a policy way. Because if they're not going to move that way, then you push it through policy at the state level, at the federal level. And it doesn't have to be heavy-handed. It can be something that involves them as stakeholders. That says to them, it's kind of when I think about regulation, and I had this conversation years ago on some pollution regulation, there's kind of regulation where you say to them, okay, I'm going to measure the following 52 things, and you have to make sure you're below all those numbers. That tends to be challenging because you're depending on the regulators and the people working there to figure all out. The other way to do it is what's called goals-based regulation. So I say to somebody, look, I want the amount of stuff, call it whatever you want, particulate matter, carbon, whatever, coming out of your facility to be at this level or below. You figure out how to do it. Do it any way you want to do it, but that's the target. And a lot of businesses, or sensible businesses, prefer that. Because they say, rather than having to constantly every year you tweak this and you tweak that, and I'm trying to do this, is you say to me that's what I need from you, and then I, as the business person, as the business owner, can figure out how best to invest to do that. So they like that, and businesses also like longer term stability in policy. Right? That's been something that's been very important here in Massachusetts, because since we did the Green Communities Act in 2008, we've had a really steady set of policies and working as stakeholders together, so that people could count on things like solar incentive financing and others, because it takes a while for businesses to do these things. And if you create a great policy and a year later you change it, it doesn't work too well. It doesn't work as a consumer either, frankly, right? I mean, you don't want to hear that if you do this in the next 3 months, you can help the planet, but after that, you can't do it. That's not helpful to you, because you may not be ready to buy your next car in 3 months. You want to know that anytime in the next 3 years, right? That's what happened recently when the state last year restarted the electric vehicle rebate program. They went through money, they went through all the money they had. They decided to restart the program. And when they restarted the program in 2020, they funded it for 2 full years. And so that people knew that, between now and next year, if you buy an EV or a plug-in hybrid, you can get these incentives. They also did something else, is that they kind of changed it a little bit, so that if you bought a car worth more than $50,000, you didn't get the incentive. Rightly figuring that, we have only a certain amount of money that the taxpayers give us, right? And somebody who's spending $80,000 on a car, do they really need it? Probably not. Let's target the other levels to get people who are can't afford to spend as much on cars moving. So these things all work together, right? Because that gives people an incentive to say, oh, yeah, I get an extra $1,000 if I buy this electric vehicle. That helps, right? When the manufacturers are doing the right job in selling them. I will tell you that when I looked at the cars, I found it very frustrating that a couple of the manufacturers who actually had an electric vehicle, you go in the dealerships and clueless, right? You had to go find a dealer that actually had somebody who worked with their electric vehicles. I bought a Tesla after all that for a number of reasons. But you go there and they're all Tesla. They're all about electrics. I mean, there's no tell me how this thing works or what I can do. That's what they sell. So, everybody plays a role here.
So I guess my final question, I know you glanced on investing and cutting down on meat and electric vehicles, but how can consumers pressure corporations more to make absolute changes? And I'm not talking about small businesses. I'm talking about I think it was the Guardian. It was a list of 100 or so companies that were responsible for 71% of emissions.
Right. Well, like anything else, I mean, if you have a very large entity that's dependent upon millions of people for its livelihood, in effect, it's hard for one or two people to make a difference. That's clear. But there's ways of multiplying the the effect of people's actions, and that includes supporting businesses and investment firms. And this is where the sustainable investing part of my work comes in. I mean, clearly, as people with their own savings and with retirement savings, whether it's a college, university, and an endowment, or a pension fund, or others are making these decisions, they are saying to corporations, individually as shareholders, and in collectively as multiple groups of shareholders, whether they're filing, sometimes they'll file proxies, you'll hear about that. But a lot of the work that happens in this field is called engagement. It's where large investors, asset owners, we call them, right? Or investment firms that on behalf of the asset owners will sit down with a company and say, you know what you're doing doesn't make sense from a long-term shareholder value perspective, doesn't make sense from an environmental social perspective. You can do better, and we want you to do better. And by the way, we represent a lot of shareholders. And by having that level of engagement, they've had some real successes. They're not always trumpeted in the media because they're not a big fight or anything, but they're happened because these investors sit down and talk with the companies they've invested in and say, they ask for an explanation. Why are you doing this? Just the way any other investment call, they do the same thing. I mean, this is what investors have done for years. They go on an earnings call and they'll ask, so why did you invest in this? Why did you bring out this product? How is this going to help my shareholders and the people who own the stock? Same thing. I'm saying to them, hey, if you're a utility, if you're an auto company, if you haven't committed to moving to electric vehicles, okay, I mean, however old you are, I'm investing for the longer term, right? And in 15 or 20 years, if you are nowhere, and I would put company I'd put furthest behind of the majors would be Stellantis, the old Chrysler Jeep folks. They're to me, they're way behind. And I personally would look at them and say, well, wait a minute, if I want to own oil stocks in some automobile manufacturers, right, because I believe that's a business that's going to grow around the world, do I want to invest in an automobile manufacturer who has a plan to be in the hybrid and the electric vehicle market and to be a leader and to have those products available? Or do I want to run somebody who's saying, oh, the heck with that, I'll just put out large gas, 8-cylinder vehicles, and I don't care because people are buying them today. My view as an investor might be, yeah, that's true, but I don't think that's going to be true in 5 or 10 years. And since I'm investing for the longer term, I don't want to invest in you. So that does happen, and people can have an influence on that through their own investments and through the companies that they work for and through pensions and university endowments. University endowments are a good example because they're perpetual, right? University has an endowment because the university tends to be around forever. So it is really important for a university to say, if you're a business that's destroying the planet, and I anticipate that this university is going to be around here in 50 or 100 years, that's not a good investment.
Although things are not in the most ideal place in regards to climate change, speaking with Michael did help me to be a lot more optimistic. Instead of placing the blame and responsibility of our climate problems on corporations, Michael emphasized that we take an individual responsibility for our actions. Whether it's buying an electric vehicle, getting solar panels, or even something as little as cutting down your meat consumption, they all help. You can also help to cut down carbon emissions by investing responsibly, taking the time to determine which companies you align with on an ethical and environmental level can be massively influential in helping save our environment. Whatever action you take to solve this climate crisis, none are too small.